Well, good evening, everybody. They always say to give a successful presentation, you should have good handouts. So when you came in, you would have found on your seats little seed packets. My wife Marcella put these together this afternoon, along with my father-in-law Dick and son Kyle. So these came out of our garden in the front yard at the recent Channel Islands Park Foundation Bring the Islands Home events. We've been picking up plants and bringing them back home. And anyhow, the buckwheat put out a lot of seeds this week, and so we wanted you to all take some home. So spread the flowers. It feels a little weird to be on this side of the podium for one of these talks, because usually I'm like sitting out there in the back listening to it or watching it on the island, because I wasn't on the mainland the week that it happened. So it's a little strange being up here, but I'm delighted to have the opportunity to do this. This presentation is kind of expanded from a paper that we did for the California Island Symposium back in October. And for that symposium, for the proceedings, they allow you to submit a paper of 12,000 words, which, just cram 40 years of history into 12,000 words is kind of a challenge. And then they give you 15 minutes to present it at the symposium. So, it's sort of the Cliff Notes version. So it's nice to be able to talk a little bit more at leisure about it. Now, when I submitted the paper, it came back from the peer reviewers, with its criticisms of, you need to fix this if you want it in for submission. And one of the things they challenged was the title of it, The Administrative History of San Miguel. And I guess that's because a lot of people don't know what administrative history is. They want it to be, the history of the National Park Service on San Miguel Island from 1963 to 19 whatever. But an administrative history, I guess that is kind of a local term within the within the Park Service, but it's an important term. So the administrative history is our history. It's our institutional knowledge. It's the story of how we got to where we are today. You could do a lot of other histories about San Miguel, about the shipwrecks or the research that's taken place out there, but this is our story. And to prove that it's our story, I would like all of those folks in this room that have lived or worked or led trips on San Miguel Island to stand up for a moment. So I always say that history is a perishable resource, that you only have that one moment to capture that picture, to write that story in the logbook, to tell that tale. And when it's gone, it's gone. And so all of you that have lived and worked and volunteered out there, you're all part of this administrative history. So tonight is your story. All right, Josh, help me out here. He swore that the right button would do it. All right. Waiting for the cue from the... There we go, and we're live. We're back in business. So this guy right here, this is Mike Hill. He was the first San Miguel Island Ranger back in 1976 originally. And back in spring of 2013, I was corresponding with Billy Horn, the first park superintendent. And he gave me Mike Hill's phone number. So Mike, after going on from San Miguel, he had a big career in the Park Service. He retired as a superintendent back in Petersburg. And then he moved down to Texas. He worked for about 5 years with Texas State Parks, and then retired there in Fort Davis, which, curiously enough, was where I moved from when I came to Channel Islands. I last worked at Fort Davis National Historic Site. So there's weird synchronicity here. So anyhow, Mike and I we got on the phone and we started telling island stories, like Rangers do. And Mike said, we need to write the administrative history of San Miguel Island. And so that's the other reason I'm sticking with that title, is because that's the title that Mike came up with. And we said, well, it'd be really great if we could get a bunch of the former Rangers together. There were really, 6 of us that had been sort of long-time permanent Rangers on San Miguel. And so in November of that year, we managed to get 5 of us together out on San Miguel Island. The one guy that we were missing was Tom Cox. I was trying for the longest time to track down Tom Cox. And finally, Mike was saying, we're not getting any younger. We need to do this if we're going to do it. So that November, we got everybody together. So going from right to left there, that's Rob Dano, Reed McCluskey. Next to him is Billy Horn, the first park superintendent. Mike Hill in the middle there. Next to Mike is Rob Dano's son, Troy. Actually, it's Troy Miguel Dano. He was born when Mike first came to San Miguel Island, and Mike was so into the place he even named his son after the island. My immediate predecessor, Mike Mackey, who's at San Miguel Mountains now, yours truly. And in the front row, we've got Reed's wife, Marlene, and then former Chief of Cultural Resources, Ann Houston, who came out to help with all the oral histories that we were doing there. And everybody brought, not just their stories, but they brought their pictures. And Mike brought along a couple of keepsakes, which are now in the corner of the ranger station up on the wall. If you're ever out there and wonder why we have a beat up paddle leaned up against the wall there, that paddle is Mike Hill's. Something he found on the beach. He used as a hiking stick throughout his career out there. And it's now part of the ranger station decor. He also brought out a Park Service burgee, Park Service pennant. This one right here. We usually have that hanging on the wall in the ranger station. It says Anacapa 1976 on it, because that's where he started off as a seasonal ranger. Later, when he had his own sailboat and used it as a ranger station, that was his ranger station flag on his sailboat. And last week, we had the Google Trekker camera out on San Miguel. Is anybody familiar with the Google Trekker camera? It gives you these street view visions of the park. And the Google crew had missed San Miguel when they came out, so the Channel Islands Park Foundation made arrangements to borrow the camera and brought it out to San Miguel. Rocky Rudolph, our GIS specialist, along with his brother-in-law, Jason, and my volunteer, Greg Olson, they spent the week hiking all the trails. And when they were doing this trail that came up to the ranger station, we put this flag up. So if you go to the Google Earth Street View when it gets posted, there'll be this little Easter egg in there. It's our tribute to Mike Hill. But to really start the story of San Miguel, if you want to go back to when the first Park Service person set foot on San Miguel, that was actually back on January 3rd of 1937. And that was when the Cabrillo Monument was commissioned. So 80 years ago, this was brought out by a Portuguese civic group out of San Francisco that wanted to commemorate Cabrillo's voyage. And at that point, there was this 4-year-old national monument down in San Diego called Cabrillo National Monument. And so among the dignitaries that came out that day was John White, superintendent of Cabrillo. Signed the logbook or the guest book at the Luster Ranch House, and was part of the opening ceremonies when that was introduced out there. Channel Islands National Monument itself was founded the next year. Franklin Roosevelt established a national monument out of Santa Barbara and Anacapa Islands. These islands have been offered to the Park Service by the U.S. Lighthouse Service, which is part of the Department of Commerce. They put what they needed out there. They figured the rest of the island they could part with, so they kept the little lighthouse reservations and gave the islands to the Park Service. San Miguel Island missed being part of that by about 4 years, because in 1934, San Miguel was transferred from the Commerce Department to the Navy Department. So it was not up for grabs as part of this land transfer in 1938. So time would have to pass for that. The Park Service did go out there in 1939, though. There was 2 people that did a tour of all of the islands. Lowell Sumner, a Park Service biologist, and Richard Bond, who was a scientist from Soil Conservation Service. They came out, visited the island. Their names are in the guest book of the ranch as well. They wrote a report about their field tour afterwards. And for San Miguel, they said that the place is a melancholy picture of desolation and ruin. But they also added that, with some erosion control and some restoration, that they really appreciated the values that could be there, with a little better care. But that was not to be. The World War II came along, and sheep ranching kept going all the way up until 1948, and then the Navy exercised its ownership of San Miguel Island, gave the ranchers 72 hours to evacuate, and then it started dropping bombs out there. The Park Service got interested again back in the late 1950s. 1957 to 59, they were working on the Pacific Coast Seashore Survey. So there had been a seashore survey of the East Coast, and now they were doing one for the West Coast. And one of the things that was sort of a driving influence for including San Miguel in this was that the Navy was talking about setting San Miguel aside as a naval petroleum reserve. don't know if there's any oil out there. We can barely get water out of the ground, but because there was some interest in developing it for oil resources, they wanted to make sure that was included in the study. Then in 1963, there was a prospectus that came out actually for a Channel Islands National Park that would include all 5 islands, including San Miguel. But recognizing the fact that it was owned by the Navy, that that was the primary purpose of the island, and that any Park Service interest would be secondary to that. At the same time, the Park Service and the Navy started working on an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, between the two agencies. And this was signed at the very top. This was signed by the Secretary of the Navy and the Secretary of Interior in 1963. And this agreement was what got the Park Service involved in San Miguel Island. And it was to get them to help with protection and the research of San Miguel. And one of the big watersheds that happened during that was Charles Rozier's archaeological survey. If you've ever seen Charles Rozier, he's this guy right over here. He's from the LA County Museum, and he did, the superlative archaeological survey of San Miguel. Nobody will probably ever get as good a crack at it because he was there before all the vegetation grew back. So, mapped hundreds and hundreds of sites, including the old ranch house, actually. The only illustration that we have of the ranch house, the only diagram of it we have is from Charles Rozier. So that was one of the big research projects that the Park Service promoted as part of that agreement. The other thing the Park Service got involved in was getting rid of the sheep because 72 hours, they didn't get too many sheep off. The Navy did close the range for a couple of weeks in 1950 to give Bob Brooks a chance to round up some of the sheep. But there were still sheep running around in the mid-60s there. So for a couple of days in 1967, one park ranger and 2 naval officers flew out there in a helicopter, and they spent a couple of days. They shot 148 sheep, and that was the end of sheep ranching on San Miguel. So what we have there now is 50 years of recovery without sheep grazing on the island. Probably one of the most significant things that happened out of that 63 agreement as far as the preservation of the island. Now, in 1974, Bill Ehorn comes along as superintendent of Channel Islands National Monument. And I've often said there's 3 ways that a piece of land can become part of the national park system. One is by executive order, as was the case when Franklin Roosevelt created Channel Islands National Monument using the Antiquities Act. The second is by act of Congress, as happened back in 1980 when Congress created Channel Islands National Park. The third way is to have Bill Ehorn as your superintendent. So San Miguel actually opened to the public as part of Channel Islands National Monument without ever being added to the national park system. So just based on this MOU between the Park Service and the Navy, Bill was able to get the island open to visitors. And it really happened in 1976. Bill had been in the park for a while, and he wanted to go out and really kind of get to know San Miguel Island. Flew out to the dry lake bed all by himself, hiked out to Point Bennett, where he met Bob DeLong from the National Marine Mammal Lab. And the 2 of them spent the night out there. And if you've ever been up to Yosemite, there's a sign in the valley there that commemorates the spot where Franklin Roosevelt and John Muir sat around the campfire and talked the forest good. It was one of those influential moments in Park Service history. And I think that night at Point Bennett was a similar moment for Channel Islands. Because they got to talking, they went through some abalone and some wine, and just Bill came away really charged up and inspired to do something with San Miguel and to see Channel Islands become a national park. So that was our John Muir moment there. Was the 2 of them spending the night out there, probably one of the most influential evenings in the Channel Islands. So Bill came back in October of '76. He updated the agreement with the Navy, worked with Les Malin down at the naval base, and the 2 of them came up with an agreement that would open the island to visitors. So one of the problems that Bill found was that the Park Service didn't really have the legal authority to spend money on San Miguel Island because there was no public purpose there. So talked the Navy into opening up for limited day use, and that public purpose gave the Park Service the ability to expend its resources there. Also, in the '63 agreement, it had said that the Park Service within 3 years would complete a natural and cultural resource assessment of the island. And Bill didn't think that had ever been thoroughly done, so he launched into doing that. in the next month, November of '76, he convened a panel of experts. These were like the best minds when it came to the islands, and also some of the biggest critics of the Park Service managing it. So it was folks like Kerry Stanton from Santa Cruz Island, Starker Leopold, Ralph Philbrick from the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, Dennis Power from the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. Bob DeLong was on it, Les Malin from the Navy. And so this Blue Ribbon panel, they got together and Bill asked them for their advice in managing San Miguel Island, had them help come up with the plan for it. And they suggested two things that came out of that. So one was get rid of the burros, and the other was to put a ranger out there. And in December of '76, Bill did both. So he took Mike Hill, who at that point was a seasonal relief ranger alternating between Anacapa and Santa Barbara Islands. And he sent Mike out to San Miguel Island to scout out the island, get to know the place, pick a spot for a ranger station, and to find out where the burros were hanging out. And then towards the end of that tour, Bill came out with the chief ranger, Mac Shaver, and a biologist, and they went to work getting rid of the burros. I think there were 34 or 38 burros left at the end there, and by the end of that week, there were none left. So about 40 years now that we've had no grazing animals on San Miguel Island. So again, one of those big watershed moments in the restoration of San Miguel. Now Mike went back to Anacapa after that, and then shortly after that, he was hired as permanent ranger at Petrified Forest in Arizona. So in the summer of '77, San Miguel opens to the public for visitation, and this was the first ranger station right here. Isn't that great? Yeah. For those of you familiar with the spot, the Cabrillo Monument's just right up on the ridge over here. This is basically just right outside the campground junction as you're coming up from the beach there. And so that was the ranger station for the first season, and it literally lasted one season before the wind did it in. The next season, Mike Hill came back in 1978, this time as the permanent San Miguel Island ranger. And he and maintenance worker Wayne Pirro staked out a location down in Niagara Canyon and built this platform tent down there, which served for the first year, hosted many dignitaries. That's actually Director Whalen, Park Service director. I think he's the first director of the Park Service to visit San Miguel Island. And the windmill's still there, yeah. That tent lasted one season. And then that got replaced by the deluxe model here. This was a 12 by 16 cabin tent, plexiglass windows, overhang in front, hot and cold running mice. Sweet interior. That chair was actually still on San Miguel when I started out there. That survived that long. Back in those days, there was a regular visitor to San Miguel Island, Barry Schuyler, on his boat, the Cassandra. Anybody know Barry back there? Yeah. Barry was kind of an island legend. He was a lecturer at UCSB in the Environmental Studies Department. And one night, Mike Hill spent the night aboard the Cassandra with Barry. They polished off a fifth of Jack Daniels and spent the night talking about San Miguel Island and the national parks. And Barry wrote about that in the log. And the next day, the log entry he wrote was, we'll try to find him an intern for the summer. And not only did he find him an intern, he found him a boatload of interns. So that's Mike right back there in the corner against the bulkhead with a bunch of the interns that Barry recruited. And this became the first staff of San Miguel Island. So these folks were in the environmental studies program, and as part of their curriculum, they studied about San Miguel Island, and then they'd come out and they'd spend a couple weeks out there working on projects. And they'd typically have like a senior project that they'd work on. One of those grew up to be a guy named Rick Wiles. Some of you may know him from the Nature Conservancy. Rick was one of those UCSB interns, and his senior thesis was about a proposal for a trail to Harris Point. And so here's Rick sitting out at the end of what is now that trail. So the interns were kind of the first of the island staff out there. Over the years, we had a number of seasonals and volunteers that worked out there. We had seasonal rangers up until 1995. That's Kevin Craig. He was the seasonal out there in 1994. 1995, we had 11 law enforcement rangers in the field at Channel Islands. In 1996, we had 6 of them. So major budget attrition. It's kind of a combination of some things being reallocated, flatline budgeting, a few programs being cut. So, the staff was virtually half of what it was the previous year, and we had no more seasonals on San Miguel from that point forward. So since then, it's been entirely volunteers that have been the relief rangers out there. And that, of course, is George Roberts on the right there. He's been my right hand for over 20 years now. Let's hear it for George. He's closing in on it. What do you have, George, 93, 94? Yeah. So yeah, George has literally spent more tours on San Miguel than all of the previous permanent San Miguel Island Rangers. And George is among a cadre. There's a bunch of folks that stood up here in the room at the beginning that are among the volunteers that keep the lights on out there. And we literally would not be in business out there if it wasn't for the volunteer staff. The new agreement with the Navy is we have to have somebody on the island anytime that we have public ashore. So we're not going to do that with one permanent island ranger. So the volunteer staff is really essential out there. Getting to the island has always been an interesting challenge. Mike Hill solved that by buying his own sailboat. In 1979, he bought a Cal 28. It was called the Poco Loco. Later, it was rechristened the Peregrinus. And this became his ranger station. This is where he flew that burgee that we had on the flagpole at the beginning there. In a year and a half, he made about 15 trips to San Miguel with this, hauling park staff, volunteer staff. It was this floating ranger station wherever he happened to make it that week. And that was his means of getting to San Miguel. He even worked out a deal with Billy Horn where the park would somehow slip him money for the gas for feeding the 4-cylinder engine that ran that thing out. Some of the other transportation out there, one of the best things that came out of the agreement with the Navy is that the Navy provided transportation and support for the Park Service. So one of the best deals out of that was the H-46 Sea Knight. There was a squadron of these at Point Mugu back in those days, and these moved a lot of cargo out to the islands. Propane tanks, water tanks, what you name it. Rangers called this Air Mugu. And Air Mugu is kind of a quirky airline. So there were times where you would take off going to San Miguel Island and you would end up on San Nic because we were a secondary mission for them. Their real purpose was search and rescue. So I remember getting on an H-46, heading for San Miguel Island, and next thing you know, they've got a F-14 off, and so we're sitting at San Nic, where they have to be stationed during this operation. And after that, we finally made it to San Miguel. Sometimes people would spend the whole day sitting around all packed up and ready to go, and the helicopter never showed up because it had other things going on. Other times, somebody would call up on the radio and say, hey, they're going to be there in 15 minutes. Get ready. It was a great relationship. A lot of Rangers knew how to cultivate it. They would bake stuff so that whenever the flight proved. Reed McCluskey was really good at this. Reed got himself so many rides in from Santa Barbara Island because he always had cookies and brownies and stuff there. And it was reciprocal, too. There was one time, and it's described in the logs, where the helicopter had been out to service the weather station up on San Miguel Hill. Afterwards, they came down to the ranger station to say hi. They're shooting the breeze with the folks there at the station, and the people that were there were kind of lamenting that they were almost out of beer. And the guys from the Navy said, "Oh, that's too bad." Later in the day, the folks had been out in the field working. They come back. The helicopter had returned with 3 cases of beer. So Air Mugu was a big part of the administrative history of San Miguel Island. Another piece of aviation history out there, and this almost harkens back to George Hammond's days. This was Sandy Braden, and back when Reed McCluskey was the ranger, Sandy had a long-time interest in the islands and had been doing some flying, and so the park actually contracted with Sandy to haul things that the Navy wouldn't, so like gas and propane, stuff like that. Sandy would fly it out in a Cessna 180, and he was flying park staff too up until one inauspicious day when it was Reed McCluskey training Tom Cox, who was coming on as the new San Miguel Ranger. They just finished their tour out there. Sandy was picking him up to fly him back to the mainland. Had a problem on takeoff. He boarded the takeoff, and the plane ended up flipping upside down. Nobody got hurt, but that was the end of flying Park Service staff. He did a few trips for researchers after that, but that was sort of the end of private citizen aviation. Sandy actually signed up as a volunteer. He provided relief coverage out there, staffed the island several times, and helped out with a number of projects out there. He used to leave his plane tied up out there overnight until one night when the mice went through and ate all the wiring out of it. And that was sort of the end of spending the night out there. But probably the plane that's made the most landings of any aircraft on San Miguel Island is this one right here. It's a N55JA. It's a 1971 Britten-Norman Islander that Channel Islands Aviation acquired back in 1975. And that thing has, I can easily say, hauled over 1,000 tons of material and personnel to San Miguel Island. When they first were flying to San Miguel, the strip we use today was in pretty bad shape. It was an old Navy runway that had been abandoned. So initially they would do their flights over to the lake bed over at the west end of the island, and then you would hike all your gear from the lake bed back to the other end. 79, the park kind of twisted Mark Oberman's arm and talked him into landing on the strip over here, which he did a few times, but it really wasn't suitable to do it. So they ended up getting the Navy to fly a tractor over from Anacapa, and the maintenance guys graded the airstrip one day enough to make it somewhat suitable for landing. But keeping that airstrip graded has been kind of a continuing saga since then. The best it ever got done was back in 1994 when we got the Marine Corps to sling load a full-size galleon road grader over from Santa Rosa Island. And that's the first time that the airstrip actually got really properly surfaced. By 2006, it was in pretty bad shape, and the maintenance division thought that I needed a hobby. So they brought over the old John Deere tractor that had been rusting away on Anacapa Island. So ever since the mouse project, or ever since the rat eradication project on Anacapa, this thing had been parked outdoors because they'd been raising mice inside where it used to be garaged. And so this thing had been rusting away at Anacapa for 5 or 10 years, and they said, oh, we'll send it out to San Miguel. So we got the thing, running and didn't quite get it all detailed out, but we worked on that for about 5 years, and then it actually came up for equipment replacement, and we bought this one here. So it's the only piece of equipment that's ever been bought for San Miguel. It's a Kubota B2200, and then the best thing we ever got was Clay Pelton. We hired him, and he's a great equipment operator, and you can see what he did to the strip there. It's just smooth as a sidewalk. So both of those tractors were delivered by Aspen Helicopters. They've got a Bell 212, and by stripping those things down, we were able to fly them over from Santa Rosa. And it's a whole lot better than the pick and shovel work we used to do to grade that airstrip. The other thing the Marines did for us was a major housing upgrade back in 1985. That's when we invented cargo texture. If you read those articles in Sunset Magazine, this is really stylish now. You take these Connex boxes. They're the seagoing freight containers that you see on the ships going up and down the Santa Barbara Channel. And you put doors and windows, and if you're lucky, you get a Marine Corps H-53 to pick it up off a crew boat and drop it in the canyon for you. And then you bring your maintenance crew out, and you get them to customize it a little bit. So this right here was the ranger station. This became a 4-person bunkhouse. And then over here we had a bathroom and 2 little storage units. And then to do one better, they put a fiberglass roof over the deck there, give a little veranda, put up some antennas, solar hot water heater, and voila, instant ranger station. Things got really upscale in 1988. The maintenance guys came back. They brought the Acme home well drilling kit, and they put in an actual well. Up until this point, it had been a spring box in the canyon, so we're basically just kind of, catching surface water and fox turds that wash down the canyon. But here they actually put an 18-foot deep well in the canyon, which is actually the same well we still use today. It's not really potable water, but it's it's good enough for washing up with. So that was a big upgrade in the days of the station. And another big upgrade that happened in '88, Rob Dano was the ranger there at the time, and he put in a proposal and built the original campsites on San Miguel. So Rob put in the first 3 campsites, and he was actually the first person to sleep in the campground. He wanted to be the first, so after he built it, he went down there, pitched his tent, and spent the night. After Rob left, Mike Mackey was the next ranger. He put in the next 6 sites, and so those 9 sites we have out there, they were put in there by Rob and Mike way back in the 1980s. And camping really changed the nature of visiting San Miguel Island, because up until that point, it had really just been day trips. With being able to stay overnight, people were really able to experience the island in depth, and particularly Point Bennett. You know, to do Point Bennett as a day hike from Kyler Harbor is quite a challenging trek. But you know, it's sort of like climbing Whitney. You know, if you make it up to Camp 5, you know, the first day, stay on the campground, unload your water there, and then the next day you do the summit. You do the 14-mile round trip to Point Bennett. It's a lot more tenable that way. So a lot more people, you know, really most of the people that see Point Bennett are the people that camp on San Miguel Island. So, you know, really changed the visitor experience, really changed the ranger experience too, because now rather than visitors being this infrequent and sporadic activity, it was now a pretty major part of your routine. So, for instance, this last week on San Miguel, I had some campers midweek and then campers over the weekend. So I ended up doing 5 guided hikes for about 50 miles worth of hiking in the course of that tour. So I spent a lot more time on the trail with visitors, which is a good thing. It beats sitting in a computer. Back to the box. So this was housing that was, you know, kind of near and dear to us. You know, it was a big step up from the old tent cabins, and I was really kind of fond of the place, you know, but the Park Service was not. So, you know, the Park Service back in the 1990s had some notoriously poor housing. There were people living in crappy trailers and dilapidated old shacks. And then, you know, sort of the penultimate poor housing was the idea of rangers living in shipping crates. So I was literally the poster child for Park Service housing, you know, living there. And so the director of the Park Service actually said, you know, I don't want to see any more articles about rangers living in shipping crates. You guys have got to do something about that. And so San Miguel was going to get the Conex boxes replaced right after Santa Rosa got its housing. As it turned out, there were kind of differences between the Park Service and the Vales about where the housing should go on Santa Rosa Island. And so in the interim, they decided, well, if we sort that out, let's go build on San Miguel instead. So 1996, they started construction on the current ranger station. And this was built by basically 3 or 4 guys on the maintenance crew working every other week for 6 months. And they turned that into the new station. In February of 1997, Fred Rodriguez and I stacked all of the worldly goods from the old ranger station up on the roof in mega bags. Charlie McLaughlin came in with a Bell Long Ranger and picked them up a bag at a time and slung load them up to the new ranger station. And that's where we've been for the last 20 years ever since. And then December of that year, with Marcella and the boys waving goodbye to them, we said goodbye to our old Conex boxes. They were flown off to Santa Rosa Island. Another piece of historical evolution, besides the housing out there, is the history of communications on San Miguel Island. So it started off with basically a ranger with one little handheld portable radio. It was an old Motorola MX350. I think they have like 4 channels on them, if I remember. Batteries were always dying. People were always looking for lost rangers that hadn't checked in from the island. People often had to hike over to Point Bennett to borrow a radio in order to talk. Things went a little upscale here when they got this little device called a Converticom. You'd plug the portable radio into that, and that would charge it. And then they'd hook it to an external antenna that was mounted up on the wall of the canyon. So now you could really actually talk out from the box there. That was a big step up in communication with the outside world. It still wouldn't let you call home, though. It only let you call the other islands. So for calling home, right up here, they had the old Raytheon Ray 25, 25-watt marine radio. And back in those days, there was the Santa Barbara Marine Operator, channels 25 and 86. You guys remember that one? And so that was kind of like calling on a party line, but that's how people called to or from the island, was to place a call to the Marine Operator. We eventually did get a cell phone out there, one of those big brick analog cell phones. Came in when Mike was there back around 1990. It was, this hallowed possession. We only had 30 minutes of airtime on this thing per month on the contract. So this thing lived in the safe. There were three things I kept in the safe. One was my pistol, one was the cell phone, and the third thing was the 9-volt Makita cordless drill. Those were the three things you did not want to lose. So when Marcella and I were first dating and we wanted to be able to talk at night, we both got 2-meter amateur radios and got ham radio licenses, and I'd walk up to the helipad at night and we'd talk back and forth on ham radio over the sulfur mountain repeater. So this is how communication worked until the biggest godsend of all was when Kent Bullard, the maintenance foreman, found out about an offer that GTE had that lets you call one phone number with no airtime charge to it. Now you can do that with just about any cell phone, but back then they had one plan with one number. And so we made that number an 800 number that would dial into park headquarters. And then from there we could patch out calls to anywhere in the free world. And from that point onward, we were able to actually make decent phone calls in lots of places. Digital communication also came along in the 90s. Initially in 1994, Jonathan Lewis, who had formerly been a seasonal ranger on San Miguel Island and was now an IT specialist at the Washington office, but duty stationed here at Channel Islands, still had a fondness for island rangers and communicating from remote places. And he came across this product called the RAM Mobile Data Wireless Modem. And it was this little box, with a little whip antenna on it, and you could plug that into your old IBM 386 computer. And if you took it up to the campground where it could see the mainland, you could send email at 1200 baud. And so we started doing this. We actually got email from San Miguel Island and used that for a number of years for digital communication up until Kent figured out this whole cell phone scam. And then we started dialing out through a phone modem and making our calls do that. I think we got up to 9600 baud on that one. That was really screaming. But it wasn't fast enough when things got more sophisticated. We needed more connectivity when the Park Service switched to newer email clients. And so starting in 2001, they put up a satellite internet connection. This one here is actually the third of 3 generations, and the 4th generation is coming along here pretty soon. But we've been through 3 satellite vendors now, about to go to our 4th. But this actually got us on the internet. For a while there, it gave us voice over IP, although that quickly went downhill. But they're saying the new one might. So there's the communications administrative history of San Miguel. Of course, a big part of the administrative history of the islands is the natural and cultural resource work that's gone on out there. Probably the longest history out of that is the marine side of the house. So kelp forest monitoring and rocky intertidal monitoring have been going on since the early 1980s. That was one of the pioneering programs here. And Channel Islands was one of the pioneering parks for developing resource inventory and monitoring programs. As many of you know, there were 10 parks that were selected to kind of prototype these programs. And so back in the 80s, they were doing the prototypes of this. And on the terrestrial side, they worked out the protocols back in the mid-80s, but didn't come up with the funding to implement them until the early 90s. So starting around 1993, we started doing things like fox monitoring, mouse monitoring, vegetation monitoring, and land bird and seabird monitoring. This is out on Prince Island, where there's a set of auklet boxes, and that's actually Max Shaver, former park superintendent. You wonder what superintendents did in the old days. Max out there cleaning out the auklet boxes. There's also been some restoration projects that are part of our history out there. Not quite as much on San Miguel as on other islands, just because the logistics of getting people and materials out there are so much more expensive. But one of the big ones back in the 1980s was peregrine falcon reintroduction. That's Brian Lotta up in the upper left there with one of the peregrines. Santa Cruz Predatory Bird Group set up some hack towers on the cliffs above Kyler Harbor, or maybe one hack tower. And they started releasing peregrines out there. And those birds that they released then were some of the ones that started breeding on the island eventually. There's also been some archaeological site restoration, few attempts at that. This is one that Kelly Minus worked on a few years back. And then we had some volunteers that pitched in, collected some locoweed seeds, and then David Kushner and some volunteers went out and sowed some seeds on there. So that site's actually looking pretty good right now. But we found that the key to stabilizing archaeological sites is to start with a site that's relatively stable and then work from there. And then one of the other big projects for a number of years was trying to eradicate Australasian fireweed, which is a pretty invasive weed, grows over on the western slopes from Green Mountain. And in those dark ages, before we really kind of knew what we were doing, we used to go out there with shovels and we just like dig this stuff up, rototilling it, without really thinking that the Navy used to bomb this. And especially they used to bomb the area around Green Mountain. So fortunately, nobody blew themselves up doing that. In the later years, we went for sort of a kinder, gentler approach. At least it was gentler on us. That's Mark Linder there. And he and I went out with backpack sprayers for a season or two there and found that we could do more with one backpack sprayer in a day than we could with a shovel in a week. You just had to find a calm enough day to do it. But that was one of the big restoration projects out there over the years. Of course, the biggest restoration program of all was the Island Fox Project, and that's been well covered in many other talks, so I won't get into the details of it except to kind of remark on what it meant for San Miguel. So San Miguel was the first place where we built fox pens, and in fact, that up in the upper left-hand corner there, that is the very first fox pen being built in April of 1999 when we brought the first foxes into captivity. And for 10 years, we were in the fox business out there with captive breeding, veterinary checks. There were a number of breeding biology studies that took place during that time. And by 2004, we had enough foxes that we couldn't actually house any more foxes. And so in 2004, they started doing releases. That's pictures of the first release up there with Inga Rose and Susan Capelli. And by 2007, all of those foxes that could be released had been. And there were just 2 left in captivity that were just too old to turn loose. That right there is the last one of them. She passed away in 2009 at the age of about 16 years old. She had started off as a wild-born fox, came in during the captive breeding program, and by the end of it was too old to release again. So she finished her life in captivity there and set the record as the oldest living island fox. And then in 2004, this came up. Or 2014, so this one was something that our vegetation mapping crew, there's some sandgate in the back there, came across this suspicious cylindrical rusty metal object out on the bluffs out towards Cardinal Point. And they did all the right things with it. They took pictures, they took GPS coordinates, came back, reported it. We got Navy EOD to come out, which is these folks right here. And they very carefully dug this thing up and evaluated it and determined it's not a piece of ordnance, it's some piece of aerospace debris. But the fact that EOD had to come out and check something out, that sort of got the captain's attention. At the same time, we had the draft general management plan going around, and it talked about the facilities on San Miguel Island. It mentioned the campground, and the captain didn't know there was a campground out there. In fact, the MOU we had with the Navy, when it had last been updated, it only talked about day use. And in fact, 1989, 1990, I think was the last time we had an agreement, and it basically said, we really like the way that things have been going between the 2 agencies, but lots evolved over the years. When the campground was put in, there was an agreement and approval, but nobody could find the paperwork where they said it was, and they hadn't updated the agreement to authorize it. So, with all of this thing happening, the captain said, time out. And he shut the island down, actually kicked us all off of there in April of 2014, and let the Park Service back on about a week later after completing some UXO safety training. But the island remained closed to the public for 2 years. And during that 2 years, we posted sentries with ray guns out there. Now, these are a couple of the contractors that I spent October of 2014 out there with. And they did a survey of San Miguel Island looking for unexploded ordnance. And they used both those yellow sticks, it's called a Schoenstedt. It's a ferrous metal detector that would detect any bombs or bomb shrapnel. And they also towed this guy around. This is an EM61. It's a really sophisticated metal detector that's GPS linked, so it knows exactly where it is as it goes. And so they towed this thing up and down all the trails. We actually had to reconfigure it and make it narrower so it would go up and down the trails. And then they put it out in its wider stance and mowed the beach with it. And then the guys with the Schoensteds and the metal detectors, they went back to everywhere that this thing had got a positive hit, and picked up every little nail and boot eyelet that had fallen off on the trails. Here's a postcard showing where we went. All the yellow lines on there represent track lines that were done with metal detectors. There's a total of 182 miles of metal detector track line on there. Did all of the trails, the campsites. They pulled out over 91 metal tent stakes out of the campground there. If those campers ever came up short of tent stakes, now we know where they went. We went to areas where there was known history of bombing. Places like Green Mountain, places like Crook Point, where there were big craters in the ground. And then went to some places that were regularly visited by researchers and park resource management staff. So went to fox trap locations, mouse grid locations, some vegetation points, peregrine falcon eyries that were active at the time. And, we don't know if we walked the same route, but at least we sort of passed through the same area. So it was a pretty good sampling, but it still represents less than 1% of the island's surface area. So it's, far from conclusive. But did pick up some things, largely stuff that looked like this. These are practice bombs found out towards Cardwell Point. And probably the most eye-opening thing for us was that 2 of those practice bombs were right underneath the Cardwell Point Trail. So we actually had been walking across these things for years and years. They were expended. They were both ones that had already gone off. They have like a shotgun shell cartridge in there. But they were less than a foot under the surface of the ground there. So it was pretty close all along. Finally, in May of 2016, the island was reopened to the public. This was after doing the UXO survey, an environmental condition of property assessment, a new MOU, a land use control plan, and a realty agreement, and probably a couple other things that I'm forgetting about. But they finally opened it back up to the public, and these are 2 researchers. This is Maybelline Gamboa on the left and Carolyn Cummings on the right. They were out doing the song sparrow DNA study, or song sparrow morphology study, as part of a Smithsonian project. And they were helping me out that week, so they helped put up this sign right here that says permit access only, and mounting this box on the wall. So now anybody that comes out onto San Miguel Island, if you come out to visit, you're not working for the Park Service, you have to sign a liability waiver that says that if you blow yourself up, you promise not to sue the Navy. The nice thing is that the Navy agreed to just let them self-register on the island, so you don't get turned away just because you didn't get your permit before you sailed from British Columbia or wherever you came from. So anyhow, this is the reopening of that. We took down the closure sign and put up the permit box. And also in May of 2016, something new started on San Miguel. One of the things that the general management plan enabled for the first time was public air service to San Miguel Island. And so that was offered through Channel Islands Aviation under a commercial use authorization. The very first flight, May 25th, 2016, it was chartered by a bunch of volunteers, several of whom were in the room here. It was Tara's 8th island. That's why she's holding up 8 fingers there. And so this was the beginning of a new way of visiting San Miguel Island. And actually, that was about the only way of visiting San Miguel Island in 2016, unless you had your own boat. Island Packers was spending all their skiffing energies on the beach at Scorpion. So it was not until this year that we got Island Packers boats out again. So this, unfortunately, Mike Hill, he didn't live long enough to see the island reopen. He actually passed away on May 1st of 2016. And when I was putting together the pictures for the slideshow, I came across this one. It was kind of poignant because this was the day that Mike arrived on San Miguel for the reunion we had out there. And it was November 22nd of 2013. So it was the 50th anniversary of John Kennedy's death. So the flag was flying at half staff that day. So it's a little bit bittersweet for me that one of the last pictures I've got of Mike is a picture of him with a flag at half staff. For the rest of us, I think we'll always be forever indebted to Mike that he got us all together out there, and that his passing was really the impetus for getting us to sit down and write this administrative history, because it was something that he'd said we should do, and as a result, we felt like we should do it. It's interesting, among the five of us, none of us knew more than, one or two of the others. Billy Horn was the only one that knew all of us. None of the four of us had ever met Mike before. But when we were all together out there, we all felt like we grew up together. And in a way, we did. We all grew up on the same island at different times. And I think for all of us here in the room that have lived and worked on San Miguel, you feel that same kinship with everybody else that has been there before you. And I think that's the importance of capturing these stories and these pictures and putting them down where people can get to them. They say that a good slideshow should close with a sunset, but I prefer to close with a sunrise. This is one that Inga took from a boat out in Kyler Harbor. And, I think about 40 years on San Miguel Island is just the beginning. But it's a big enough chunk of time that you can look back on it and gain some perspective. And I thank you all for coming here tonight to share in that looking back. Thank you.
We have time for some Q&A. I can bring the microphone to you before asking your question.
The research station that's at Point Bennett, I assume it's been there much longer than the ranger station that's currently there. Do they have an agreement with the Navy, and what is the situation relative to the Navy giving the property finally to the Park Service?
Well, there's no situation as far as them giving the property. Anything can happen someday, but there's no discussion of that, no plans in that respect. In our legislation and agreements and everything, it's their land until they decide to do something else with it. Regarding the research station, the Navy actually expects to have a realty agreement with NOAA, for the research station being there. The station has been there much longer than the park has. It's been there almost, I think next year will be 50 years that the station's been out. And that's a topic for another administrative history altogether. Yeah. Well worthy of it. All right, you let me off easy.
What would you vision? If money was no question, what would you vision? What would you envision for the future in terms of infrastructure out at San Miguel?
Oh, re-roofing the ranger station would be a really good start.
Well, that's a known, but above and beyond that.
The nice thing about San Miguel is it's got very little infrastructure, and I think most of us would like it to stay that way. It is a backcountry ranger station, and I think many of us were happy enough being in the Connex box. It's really all about being on the island, and the less we have out there that looks like we put it there, the better. But thanks for letting me put in a plug for the roof. Yes, the fox cages still are. In fact, Greg did an inventory of them this week for me, so we've got a kind of a list of what we're up against as far as removing it. If anybody's got any ideas for getting money to do that, my dream would be to hook up the last sling load of fox panels leaving the island. I mean, I landed the first one, and I'd like to remove the last one. Well, it was not included in the general management plan. So the only thing that was enabled was specifically the ranch strip. So in that way, it somewhat precludes landing at the lake bed. More than that, though, it's the functionality of it. The west end of San Miguel is a lot foggier than the east end. So it's hard enough getting day trips into the ranch strip a lot of days. There are weeks that go by when we don't get a flight into the lake bed. We used to kind of joke about it, when the marine fisheries crew would get stranded out there. And it's day 10 of the San Miguel Research Station hostage crisis. Well, populations have certainly gone up. So with sea lions, the numbers are higher than I'd ever seen them. I think we had 28,000 pups born this year. It was probably 20 or so, I think, when I first started. Elephant seals, it's not so much that their numbers have gone up, but that as their numbers have gone up, they have dispersed. So they cover a lot more beaches than they used to. The big wake-up call there was Kyler Harbor, which used to be a really easy place to land a boat. But now for much of the winter and spring, you could not get visitors ashore there because it's a major elephant seal colony. We had about 900 pups born there this past winter. And then the other thing that's been kind of a neat return in the last decade or so, we've had Guadalupe fur seals, a few individuals that have pupped each of the last several years. And then remarkably this year we had a stellar sea lion pup born on San Miguel. It's probably a hybrid, but the mom is a full-blooded stellar sea lion. So that's the first stellar pup on San Miguel since the 1970s. So those have been some pretty neat things to see in 25 years.
Well, thank you so much, Ian, for sharing these stories of San Miguel Island and bringing us that much closer to a very faraway place. Thank you.
Thank you.